All right, guys, day two here. I hope day one went okay for you. Today we're going to be actually jumping into studying just war theory. It comes in two phases, and we're only going to try to handle the first phase today. But before we do that, I wanted to make some clarifications. Realized pretty quickly today that I had not been very clear about how I wanted you to handle the response, um, your interaction with the material. Basically, I'm just hoping for you to kind of keep a running journal. Um, you might just open up a Word document and start working through one day at a time, just a little bit of a response, just so that you're tracking and interacting with the material. And I hope that at the end of the unit, though, will be helpful to you. And I will want to see it eventually. You can send me the file or a picture of the file, and we'll work on how you can turn it in. But basically, I want to see it just to make sure I can give you participation points and make sure that everybody's been tracking. It's hard to know, how things are going on your end, and that'll just be a helpful tool for me. But you don't have to send it to me daily. It'll be something we collect at the end of the unit when it's time to kind of, express our thoughts on the content. The content you're going to be interacting with includes, of course, the just war theory. So let's dive into it. This first phase of the just war theory is called jus ad bellum. It's Latin, which means justice in going to war. It means the manner in which you decide to go to war or how you decide to go to war. It has to be just. There must be justice in the decision-making process. So that's the phase that we're going to cover today. And there's only 7 tenets, so I hope it won't take us very long. And then there will be a little bit of a response I'm asking for from you that you'll see published on Microsoft Teams. So let's jump in. The first thing that we need to realize is that there are several presuppositions that ethicists work with when they're talking about the just war theory. 4 that basically remain common across different perspectives. I am talking about Christian ethicists, of course, and these are 4 very common presuppositions to the just war theory. One of them is the very obvious Christian conviction that we should not do any harm to our neighbor. That, of course, has really expansive applications and implications as well. I mean, there's any number of ways we could passively do harm to our neighbor or even unknowingly do harm to our neighbors. So we'd have to live very purposeful lives to make sure that we're not doing any harm to our neighbor. But that's one of the presuppositions. Another is that the way that we treat our enemy is actually kind of a litmus test for how well we love our neighbors. And that's a hard standard, and that's a hard teaching that Jesus gives us, and it's a prominent teaching that Jesus gives us as well. So we're looking to be able to love our enemies, even in the just war theory. A third presupposition is we should never take any action that will cost human lives. We should never take it flippantly. And we should realize that it's a frightful thing. Should cause us fear and trembling, to use the words of the Apostle Paul, in regards to how we should feel as we're wrestling with the decision of whether or not to go to war. And then lastly is a pretty interesting conviction for the just war theory, and it's this, that this is not just a Christian thing. Now, some of you are already kind of ahead of this and thinking like, okay, well, I know what I believe, but what does it matter what I believe if nobody else believes it? Or what does it matter that the private Christian thinks one way when the public government thinks another way? And that's interesting regarding this 4th presupposition, because nearly all Christian ethicists will say that this is something that is based on reason and in many ways sort of a natural law, one that doesn't require any faith statements or creed or any dogma. And so Christian ethicists will say that even non-Christians are to be held accountable to the just war theory. And that's reflected in history too, because you can actually see in international law and various phases of international governing bodies being put together, you can see the just war theory shaping and informing their approach and even their statutes. As you look at the United Nations or its precursor from the World War I era, and so yeah, this is not unique to Christianity per se, but many Christians have been involved in its development. For instance, historically prominent names who have been advocates of the just war theory include, of course, Augustine, which we talked about just yesterday, but then later Aquinas. You might remember Aquinas from our study of some of the arguments for God's existence. He had his 5 ways of knowing God exists. Then you'll be familiar with Martin Luther and John Calvin. Maybe a bit less familiar with Reinhold Niebuhr. He's a Christian ethicist and professor from the mid-20th century who is formative and impactful in not just Christian thinking, but American public life. And you might say even in American civil thought. He's really influenced a lot of presidents from his work. And then, interestingly, some people would actually include Dietrich Bonhoeffer among the proponents. I say that's interesting because there are plenty of pacifists who claim him as one of their own as well. But these are not nobody. Like, these are big names, right? Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin. This is a who's who list in a lot of ways. So it maybe bears that much more of our attention then. It gets our attention to note such important figures have been proponents of the just war theory. So let's launch into the 7 tenets of jus ad bellum and the decisions of going to war. The first tenet is actually almost embedded, I guess, in the terms itself. A just war theory requires a just cause. Now, most people in history would argue that the only surefire just cause is a country defending itself. Self-defense is the only cause you can be absolutely sure was a just cause. But in modern times, given our ability to know the geopolitical situation in various countries, given our ability to have insight into what's going on in certain countries, many people have begun to argue that this also includes intervening on behalf of another, especially those whose rights are being systematically trampled. You could think of plenty of examples where this might be true, and not just in American wars. You could think of an example where Pakistan was actually guilty of trampling the least of these, so to speak, in what is today Bangladesh, and India stepped in to do something about it, and that was just this past century. And so in various ways, people have begun to propose that it's possible that it's a just war if you are intervening on behalf of the least of these, and restoring justice to the lives of these who can't restore it for themselves. Now, that comes with a little bit of an asterisk, because many ethicists are concerned regarding the expansive, destructive nature of weapons these days. Post-industrial revolution, our ability to destroy is certainly exponentially greater. And so a lot of ethicists say we've got to be very, very careful in choosing to go to war. We may end up actually doing more harm than good. And so we've got to make very, very wise decisions in that regard. So we move on to the second one. The person who's making this wise decision, or the group of people who are making this wise decision, have to represent a just authority. That is to say, when war is declared, it must be through correct constitutional and governmental channels. There ought to be checks and balances in place. It shouldn't be a single person making a decision on a whim. In America, that has been true in several ways. Constitutionally, it's actually Congress that has the ability to declare war. Now, there are presidents who have circumvented that, to be sure, but we have also increased these checks and balances through what's called the War Powers Act, which is a post-Vietnam War legislation that actually makes it more difficult for the president to move into combat and war without Congress's approval. There's also an added stipulation for many people that we should seek the approval of the international governing body whenever possible. That war should not be made by a single country acting in a rogue manner, but instead a governing body, a body of countries working together should seek to bring justice to whatever situation has maybe arisen. A third one is that it has to be a last resort, that all other means of negotiation must have already been exhausted. Now this one becomes challenging because how do you ever know when all other means of negotiation have actually been exhausted? And then there's also the tipping point, and people start to worry, like, okay, if I continue to negotiate, do I make things worse? World War II comes to mind because plenty of countries tried to negotiate with Hitler to such an extent that perhaps it could be argued that he gained more and more of a foothold. It has been argued, I think, effectively that trying to avoid World War II with Hitler caused World War II with Hitler, because the longer people waited to try to do something about the injustices, the more momentum and influence and power he had at his disposal. But the just war theory actually strongly asserts that if evil could be stopped by non-violent means, then that's the way you have to go. Don't use war when peaceful resolution is possible. Number 4, you have to have a just intention. And this is one where some American wars come under fire, come under criticism, which is to say, when you go to war, it must be that you have just long-term goals, an intention of peace for all involved. And it can't be about gaining territory, and it can't be about economic gain. Maybe the easiest American war to really criticize in that manner is the Mexican-American War. We sort of implied that we were looking to redress some wrongs. This is back in the 1800s, of course, but really it turns out we were looking to expand our territory and benefit economically. So one of the things that's really difficult about this, and I would say maybe perhaps distinctly Christian about this, is that enemy states, the enemy that we're going to war against, actually must be thought of as eventually being a partner, a strategic partner for us in the way of peace, meaning that once the war is over, once justice has been restored, they must also be intact so that we can create justice with them. Now, it doesn't mean we leave the problem in place. You know, we wouldn't leave Hitler in charge of Germany or whatever country we might be thinking of, but it means that those people remain in place and intact so that justice can be had for them in their country, and we can have peaceful relationship with them. Number 5, 6, and 7 are pretty quick, so I'm going to cover them quickly because I'm running out of time, and I'm sorry this is dragging on a little bit. But number 5 is the probability of success, which I think is interesting because we sometimes, respect and venerate that person who fights the losing battle. And there are ethicists who say there can be a time and a place for fighting a losing battle or even fighting a losing war if the evil that they're fighting against is so tremendous that a point must be made. You could fight a losing battle, but otherwise, war should only be engaged in when there is hope of success. We shouldn't send people to die in vain. It's not just to waste life in war with no hope of success. Number 6 is pretty similar. It's proportionality of cost. We don't mean financial cost. What we mean is how much suffering would be caused. So let's say, for instance, a couple hundred people were taken kidnap in, an African country somewhere, and we decided we should do something about it, as that would be just. It would be incorrect for us to, let's say, use an atomic weapon to come in to try to bring justice to that situation. We would obviously be causing more suffering. Last one that we need to talk about here is that there should be a clear announcement and a declaration of war. And you could probably think of some wars where that didn't take place, and you can probably think about how unjust that really was. So if it's going to be a just war, there will be a clear pronouncement and declaration of war.